appeasing President Trump's desire or wanting him to do what President Trump wanted, which was to be able to say before the 2020 election that he had got out of Afghanistan, he just gave up a very basic thing, which was the withdrawal was America's card, you know.
Ambassador, hold on to that thought. This is a very important point you're talking about. So we're going to go live in 2 seconds.
Oh,
my colleague Hanif is going to come on live.
I can repeat my thoughts, don't you worry.
Thank you very much. Hanif.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening, assalamu alaikum, khush amadit, and namaste wherever you are. Welcome to the Center for Afghanistan Studies webinar series on Afghanistan and Peace Talk. My name is Hanif Sofizada, and I have the honor to present this crucial yet timely webinar to all of you. Today, we have a great panel of distinguished diplomats with us. In the panel, we have Ambassador Hossein Haqqani, Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne, and Ambassador Janan Mousazai. Sheikh Jan Ahmadzai, the Director for Center for Afghanistan Studies, will be hosting this session. As we all know, that the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced that the U.S. Taliban deal signed on February 29, 2020 will be reviewed under the new policy of the U.S. government for Afghanistan. The U.S. Department of Defense announced that it is reviewing a full withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. This announcement has created hopes, but also reservations in many circles here in the U.S. and in the region at large. While the Afghan government has welcomed the decision, the Taliban have started consulting countries like Iran and Russia and presumably Pakistan. The distinguished panel of career diplomats with their in-depth understanding of the region, as well as the facets of the peace process, will share their insights and potential outcomes of the decision by the US government. And as well as they will talk about the uncertainties that have been created in the region. They will also discuss its impact on the prospects of long-term peace in Afghanistan at a time when the meetings of NATO ministers of defense is taking place in Brussels right now. Please allow me to hand it over to Mr. Ahmadzai to moderate today's session. Ahmadzai, to you, please.
Thank you very much, Hanif Jan. It's my honor to host today's event and have the opportunity to facilitate a discussion with our distinguished panelists, as you said. Today we have Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne with us. He is a distinguished diplomat in residence teaching at American University School of International Service. He's also a public policy fellow at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and co-chair of its Mexico Institute Advisory Board. He's a senior non-resident advisor to the Atlantic Council at the Center for Security and International Studies and serves on the board of the American Academy of Diplomacy. Ambassador Wayne served as U.S. diplomat from 1975 to 2015, including as the U.S. ambassador to Argentina, 2003-2009, the coordinating director for development economic affairs, and deputy U.S. ambassador in Kabul, 2009 to 11, and the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, 2011 to 15. He was the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs under 3 Secretaries of State, 2000 till 2006. We also have Ambassador Haqqani. Ambassador Hossein Haqqani is a senior fellow and director for South and Central Asia at Hudson Institute. He served as Pakistan's ambassador to the United States from 2008 to 2011 and is widely credited with managing a difficult partnership during a critical phase in the global war on terrorism. Ambassador Haqqani's distinguished career in government includes serving as an advisor to 4 Pakistani prime ministers. He also served as Pakistan's ambassador to Sri Lanka from 1992 to 1993. Ambassador Haqqani is the author of 4 books: Pakistan Between Mosques and Military, Magnificent Delusion, Pakistan, The United States, and Epic History of Misunderstanding, India versus Pakistan, Why Can't We Just Be Friends, and Reimagining Pakistan, Transforming a Dysfunctional Nuclear State. Our third panelist is Ambassador Janan Mousazai. He currently serves as Vice President at Mitra Associates, as consultancy service company based in Kabul, Dubai, and London that specializes in natural resources development, agriculture, food services, and as well as government relations and logistics. Ambassador Mousazai was the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan ambassador to the People's Republic of China and the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Prior to his ambassadorial postings, Janan Mousazai served as a spokesperson and Director General for Communication at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And I am Shirzad Ahmadzai, Director of Center for Afghanistan Studies at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Our center has been here since 1972 for the last 47 years. We have served Afghanistan in the region, and of course, our student population at our university. I'll be facilitating this discussion today. Now, I would like to first ask for opening remarks from our panelists, starting with Ambassador Earl Wayne, followed by Ambassador Haqqani, and then remarks by Ambassador Jana Moosalzai. After your remarks, panelists, I will start today's session with a few questions, and then we will open the floor for questions from our audience who are here today with us via Zoom link and Facebook Live from various locations around the world. For our audience who are online with us today, you can send your questions in the Q&A section on the Zoom from Zoom windows. So Ambassador Wayne, floor is yours for your remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and with my colleagues on this panel. It's very timely that we're getting together. First, I think it's important that we get the description of the situation right, that what's at stake, what is the real narrative here. This, from the US point of view, there are a couple of big important interests. One is we have a strategic interest that Afghanistan not return to the situation it once was in, where it is a base for international terrorism. And we have an interest in that sense that chaos not return to Afghanistan, because that could allow such an evolution that would endanger stability, not only in the region, but perhaps generate attacks against friends, partners, and the United States itself. Secondly, the United States does actually have a moral commitment in Afghanistan. After the 20 years of investment, almost 20 years now of investment that we've made in Afghanistan, and the product of that is this young generation of Afghans who have a different view of the world, who have a different view and hope for their own future. We, as the United States and our partners, have held out the ideal of democracy, have held out the ideal of respect for the rights of others. However flawed we may be, and others may be, in always demonstrating all of those, it has been an ideal that we've worked for. And through our investments in education, in health in that country, promoting just a better sense of well-being, I think those ideas have really taken root among many young Afghans, and we do have a commitment, I believe, to them. So the narrative is really, how do you bring a sustainable peace to Afghanistan? And I think we're on a path to getting there, but it's not surprising that it's a bumpy path, and one that's going to take some time to get the Afghan parties that have been fighting each other for many years now to work through a very difficult agenda and try to find an arrangement that will produce a sustainable peace. And from my perspective, it's very much worth the strategic patience of the United States and its partners, both in the region and from Europe and elsewhere, to continue this effort and to bring that together. And I think what many in the United States have been saying over the recent weeks is that we are not there yet. We're on a path possibly to get there, but in particular, the Taliban has not kept their commitments to really get to a point where there is a serious peace process going on, and where violence has been reduced. Rather, violence has been increased, and we're seeing this terrible wave of assassinations and other attacks in cities. Just to conclude, the United States presence is significantly reduced. The cost in terms of funding is significantly reduced. We are still there with NATO partners, and with the help and work of our partners in the region and internationally, we should continue to press the Afghan parties and create the situation that they can negotiate something that will be a more lasting and sustainable agreement to bring what is needed peace to Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Ambassador Haqqani, your take on the situation, Biden administration and the region dynamics.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying that the objective in Afghanistan for the United States should be a stable Afghanistan, and a stable Afghanistan that works its own problems out without the need for a large number of American troops. That is what President Biden committed himself to. And I think that whatever review comes out, we will not see a return of large numbers of American troops to Afghanistan. Afghans would say that that is no longer needed. Afghanistan was totally destroyed because of Soviet occupation, the war against the Soviets, and then the civil war that followed. So after 9/11, because it had become a safe haven for international terrorists, the United States went in and helped the Afghans create new structures of government. Afghanistan now has a constitution, it has a functioning government, and yes, all governments have flaws. It may have its own flaws, and politics everywhere is complicated. Children go to school, businessmen do business. So there is a functioning government in Afghanistan. At the same time, there has been a long-going insurgency, and many Americans wanted to get out of Afghanistan, and President Trump used that as a slogan in his 2016 election campaign, and then tried to create circumstances for himself to be able to fulfill the promise before the 2020 election. To do that, his appointed negotiator, Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, an able diplomat of Afghan origin, negotiated with the Taliban. And my perception is, and I have written many articles to make that point, is that he gave away too much too soon in the negotiations just to be able to say that we have had a negotiation. The result was the Doha Agreement, which is essentially a withdrawal deal, not a peace deal. It does not have a timeline for ceasefire. It does not use the words reduction in violence or end of violence in any way. Actually, the only two commitments the Taliban make in that agreement is that they will break relations with Al-Qaeda, which they haven't, according to a recent UN report. And second, that they will engage in talks with other Afghans. So basically, the Doha Agreement threw the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan under the bus. A commitment was made that Taliban prisoners held by the Afghan government will be released without the Afghan government being party to the agreement. So in some ways, this was an agreement that was worse than the Paris Agreement in Vietnam, which was meant only to provide the American government, according to Henry Kissinger at that time, with a decent interval before the collapse of the South Vietnam government and the withdrawal of American troops. So this deal was essentially a flawed deal. And it would have come apart anyway. President Trump would have liked to be able to say in his typical way, tweet all troops out of Afghanistan today, I am proud, that kind of thing. That's what was being done. No, it was not any assurance of peace. Now, the Taliban, of course, thought that what they were getting was a promise from the Americans to get out. And that once that happened, and they had engaged with the other side for some talks, they had fulfilled their end of the bargain. They take everything very literally. They say, where is the word reduction in violence in the agreement? Where is any obligation for ceasefire? We agreed to talk and fight at the same time. The problem in Afghanistan for the government forces has been, why have they not been able to beat the insurgency in 19 years? For one thing, America has not had a 19-year plan for Afghanistan. It has always been very ad hoc. America has had 19 one-year plans for Afghanistan. So this time, hopefully, the review will suggest a multi-year commitment to help and support the Afghan government. It'll be cheaper for America because America will not have to maintain its own troops. It will involve continuing to support the Afghan national forces. That is necessary because an army can be raised relatively quickly in terms of foot soldiers, but its command structure needs time to emerge. It takes about 40 years for a military officer to go from being a second lieutenant to being a 4-star general. Now, at the moment, the Afghan military has ability to fight. It has the will to fight. However, it does not have the trained top leadership that is emerged through a natural process of evolution from second lieutenant to general. So therefore, they need time to do that. And during that period, the Americans and the NATO allies can be the guarantors of the fact that the Taliban will not overrun Kandahar and Kabul again like they did in the 1990s with external help. That does not mean that there should not be a peace process. The peace process should essentially focus on addressing the flaws of the agreement that has already been signed. It's like having a contract which is essentially flawed and both sides understand the flaws. I think the Taliban will realize soon that their expectation that the Americans will throw in the towel and then the Afghan government will collapse and then they will restore the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is something they have been saying in their own statements repeatedly. They have not given up on the idea that their narrative is simple. We were overthrown wrongly. Our government was legitimate. It is still legitimate. The emirate will be restored. And all we are doing in talking to other Afghans is to find a way of doing it with less violence. First of all, I find the term reduction in violence and less violence, fake terms. The reason being, what is reduction in violence? That the insurgent party will kill 5 people per day rather than 20 people per day. Is there a matrix for that? No. Basically, what it is a way of assuring the insurgent party that it does not have to drop its weapons before a comprehensive agreement is reached. But for that, you have to have faith that that party intends to have a comprehensive agreement. And the Taliban have made it clear that they do not intend to have a comprehensive agreement anytime soon, because their definition of peace is, as long as we are restored to power, there will be peace. As long as everybody accepts the Islamic Emirate, there will be peace. So you can't have two different systems, an Islamic Emirate and an Islamic Republic, both at the same time. You can't have, and the Taliban ideologically remain opposed to democracy. So essentially the Taliban were giving nothing and getting an American withdrawal in return under the Doha Agreement. And I think the Biden administration has rightly put that on ice. I think that there will still be talks with the Taliban if the Taliban are willing to talk. If they are not, they will need much more firepower and capacity to deal with the problems of Afghanistan. And Afghanistan will be plunged into violence again. And that's something no one wants because of its consequences being unpredictable. Secondly, I understand that Afghanistan has been at war for many years, and there are many parties. There are many parties in any country. The question is, does one party have the right to operate from bases outside the country and continue to try and take over power through violent means? They do not. So if they are really interested in peace, the Taliban will at some point have to agree to either an interim or a permanent ceasefire. And that should be the way forward. As far as US policy is concerned, I think the US should come around to understanding that building the Afghan National Security Forces, building the capacity of the Afghan government so that they do not constantly need American involvement is the way forward. And the Taliban needs to be offered and the option of becoming part of Afghanistan and Afghanistan's government, just as they are part of Afghanistan's society. But they cannot be allowed to re-establish hegemony because they simply do not have the level of support that is required for something like that. They are a totalitarian group. They have an ideology on which they have not yet compromised. And so therefore, the agreement with them for peace has to be one that takes all those realities into account. Can that be achieved? Maybe. It may require neighboring countries particularly to tell the Taliban that 19 years is long enough. You were not able to drive anybody out. You were not able to topple the government of Afghanistan. They have held, you have survived with our help maybe, but you have survived. And so it's time to negotiate a situation in which the Taliban can become part of Afghanistan's political process, but not be the dominant force in that political process through the force of arms. I think that that will be a very tough negotiation, but that is the negotiation that needs to be undertaken. As far as the American position is concerned, I think that has changed now. The reality has changed. America still wants not to remain involved militarily in Afghanistan endlessly, and that is a correct call for the American side. At the same time, it is no longer about the satisfaction of the president being able to tweet victory rather than having actual success in a negotiating process.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You touched upon wonderful points. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions from our audience, and I have a few questions to follow up after Ambassador Mosaddegh speaks. Ambassador, what's your take on the topic, Biden administration and the region dynamics?
Thank you so much, Mohammad Zaiseb and Sufi Zadaseb, for this invitation, and it's definitely a great privilege and honor to be with such distinguished panelists, and very difficult to really follow two such outstanding speakers, but I associate myself with what they have described about the situation in Afghanistan. I think we are facing a situation that is one of high risk and high danger for the people of Afghanistan primarily, but also I think for the region, because a collapse of the peace process in Afghanistan will not be just dangerous for the people of Afghanistan and result in a tremendous escalation of violence, but it will also unleash a torrent of dangers for the region, from terrorism to the spread of extremism, as well as organized crime, whether it's drug trafficking, weapon smuggling, and new waves of refugees going out into the region. And I think the risk of failure has increased significantly. The Taliban are not talking to the Afghan government. They are intent on taking over power by force, just as Ambassador Haqqani has rightly pointed out. That's their current position. And then there is no consensus at the regional level. Obviously, the peace agreement has to be negotiated between the two Afghan parties, the Afghan government, which has domestic legitimacy and international recognition, and the Taliban on the other hand. But I want to say a few words about the dimension that I think is equally critical in the success or failure of this process, which is the role of Afghanistan's neighbors and key powers in the region. So far, that dimension has unfortunately been given little attention and diplomatic capital, mainly by the United States, which basically struck a deal with the Taliban under the Trump administration to facilitate a US withdrawal from Afghanistan. So it was an American withdrawal agreement more than an agreement as part of an Afghan peace process. And there, we continue to have a situation in the region where you have internal divisions and antagonisms at the regional level between various countries. India, Pakistan is a prominent example, but also other countries, Iran with Saudi Arabia, the problems that are there, those also affect the situation in Afghanistan. But you also have a set of fraught relations between countries in the region and the United States. The US-Iran relationship, US-China, US-Russia relationships are good examples of that. So although some commentators, especially in the US, argue that this time around in Afghanistan, there is a consensus in the region for support to a peaceful Afghanistan, although that might be true on the surface. And yes, all neighboring countries and regional key powers have voiced statements in support of the Afghan peace process, in support of a peaceful, stable Afghanistan. But if you dig a little bit deeper, then it becomes very quickly evident that the argument of a regional consensus being there is absolutely unfounded. There is no basis for that because the region has not taken any leadership role, whether it's China or Russia or Iran or Pakistan or India. India is actually has been kept outside the main discussions that have taken place on Afghanistan. And so what that actually contributes to is a negative dynamic where countries in the region, including neighbors, continue to maintain their relationships with various factions in Afghanistan, as opposed to supporting an Afghan peace process. So Pakistan supporting the Taliban, and then Iran and India supporting the government, and on and on. And if unless we address that, and we are facing obviously the May 1 deadline for the complete withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan, what that will result in is basically a return to the default situation that has dominated the region, which is different countries supporting different sides in Afghanistan, and then us potentially getting a renewed cycle of both domestic conflict in Afghanistan, but also a regional proxy war fought on Afghanistan's territory. So to address that, I think when we've tried to make this argument through our think tank, the Heart of Asia Society, and through the longest running Track 2 dialogue that we've been hosting on regional and international support for Afghan peace, we have tried to make the argument that the number one priority for the United States and for its NATO partners, and mainly that have been present in Afghanistan over the past nearly 20 years, is to initiate an urgent, high-level diplomatic engagement with the region, which is inclusive of all of Afghanistan's neighbors and all the key regional powers. You cannot have a trilateral or quadrilateral format where you only talk to Russia and China, and then maybe include Pakistan or invite Iran, which typically does not attend meetings when the US is present, and expect that you will have regional consensus or a regional guarantee mechanism worked out for Afghanistan. That is not possible. It has been tried, it has failed. So our hope is that the Biden administration will learn that key lesson and hopefully undertake a diplomatic engagement with China, with Russia, with Iran. Iran has a key role to play in the success or failure of the Afghan peace process. India, the other countries that I've mentioned, in the 2 months that we have between now and the withdrawal timeline, so that there is a regional consensus on an extension of that US military withdrawal timeline that allows for enough time for the countries in the region to exercise their positive influence with the Taliban, whether it's pressure, whether it's encouragement, to take talks with the Afghan government seriously and to work out a solution that not only addresses the differences between the two sides internally, but also a solution that integrates the legitimate concerns and interests of countries in the region, so that we come to a political solution that is not just there for 3 months or 6 months or a year, but that's lasting, and that both the Afghan parties will support to safeguard, but also which the region will support. The US has engaged countries in the region, but not at a sufficiently high level in my view. Ambassador Khalilzad has made his efforts. If he is empowered to play that role under the Biden administration, fine. Otherwise, it has to be at least at the level of the US Secretary of State for the US engagement to be taken seriously, especially by countries like Russia, like China, like Iran and others. So I'll leave it there, and happy to address any questions.
Thank you very much. There are a few questions popping up on our chat screen, but I would like to start with a question from Ambassador Wayne. Ambassador Wayne, I mean, other ambassadors, please comment whenever you see it necessary. There's a huge difference between our previous Department of State and the current one. There's more professional diplomatic approach to issues rather than White House dealing foreign affairs directly, like the Afghan case or any other case. That gives President Biden a lot of diplomatic options where it encourages diplomats to take lead on very important issues such as this one. Secretary Blinken has talked to President Ghani a couple of times. One was 2 days ago, talking about peace process. This has put the inheritance of the whole situation has put Biden administration in a position to look for options, how to deal with the deal itself. As Ambassador Haqqani has said, it was a flawed deal just for withdrawal, not peace for Afghanistan, and with consequences that we can also see and foresee. What are the big options? You know, we did talk about what are the big options for President Biden to tackle this problem that has been going on since 2002? And are there any feasible options in the short term or in the long term in terms of how diplomatic pressure, diplomatic engagement could help bring peace and security and facilitate a peaceful, responsible withdrawal of the US forces from Afghanistan and the region, or if there is any need for staying longer than what it is right now? You're muted, Master.
Thank you. I think that one of the key points is that there's been a great misunderstanding of the time and effort it takes to actually forge a peace agreement, to build consensus. And if you look at other peace agreements around the world where there's been a long time conflict between parties of the same nationality, it doesn't happen easily. People have to sit down and talk for a long time. And often they have third-party facilitators to help that go forward, which is something that I and others have argued for. The United States needs to play a role, but the United States doesn't need to be the facilitator necessarily to help bring Afghan parties together. And as Ambassador Mosasai was saying, to help build a consensus in the region, the United States has a key role to play, but it's going to take a while. So the two things I think needs to be happened. One is that you have to have a realistic view of the time needed to bring people to solutions. I mean, right now, there's not agreement even on the agenda to work through and the priority of that agenda. There's big disagreement. And as Ambassador Haqqani was indicating, there's a tremendous gap between the end state that the Taliban is arguing has to take place and what the other Afghan parties represented in the Kabul government peace team are arguing for in favor. So this is going to take a while. That means I think that one of there are several ways you can do this, but one is to look at, again, go back to a conditions-based approach to the US involvement there and not a timeline. And as you remember, that's even where the Trump administration began. The first policy put forward by the Trump administration before this Taliban-US agreement was one based on conditions and verifying those conditions and going forward. And I think even within the context of the US-Taliban agreement, there are a number of conditions that clearly aren't being met right now. And then there are other things, as has been mentioned, that are sort of fuzzy, like the level of violence, the commitment to reducing the level of violence, that probably shouldn't have been as fuzzy as they are in that agreement. But this is a time to look at that again and look at it in light of the real interests of the United States and its international partners, including its regional partners. So the other tool I think can be very helpful, is very much consistent, is a Friends of Afghanistan group that is engaging on a regular basis, that may get started at the level of secretaries of state and ministers, but needs to continue at a lower level to support this process, to build consensus, to meet on a regular basis. If you look back at other international crises that have been really hard, I remember back to the period when Yugoslavia disintegrated. There was essentially a Friends of the former Yugoslavia group that got together, and they met for years as people were trying to find solutions to that problem. And Ambassador Holbrooke, I may remember, was a key US participant in that. And it was a tough process, even among the closest friends of the United States, to reach agreement on what was the best outcome and how to go forward. So it wouldn't be surprising that you would have a Friends of Afghanistan group with the region, with countries from a bit further away, but have an interest there, that this process needs to go on at the same time you're trying to facilitate talks between Afghans to get that coincidence of views that's going to really produce a situation that can have a modicum of stability. for Afghanistan and for the region. And it's not going to be easy. So I think President Biden has a number of different options. And I don't suspect we're going to see a dramatic, gigantic announcement and change. But I think you're going to say, we're going to revisit this, we're adjusting this. We're not, that date is not set in stone because the conditions have not been met. But that hasn't been fully announced yet. There are a series of meetings that have been taking place in Washington. These phone calls and consultations with Afghans, with others are going on. They're going on in Brussels today. I'm very hopeful that coming out of that, we will see a reoriented US policy, but also with the US and its close partners and friends in this process. And then that will reach out and include Pakistan and other neighbors and bring them into a process where we can really get to a sustainable peace.
Thank you, Ambassador. You talked about the recent impacts of that one in Pakistan. I'm going to ask a question from Ambassador Haqqani. Whenever we talk about the Afghan peace, Pakistan is an integral part of the regional dynamics as the strongest neighbor of Afghanistan, involved in the Afghan affairs and conflict for the last 40 years. How do you see Biden administration policy towards Afghanistan and Pakistan? How would that shape into bringing Pakistan into a mode where it could cooperate? Do you still believe, especially the Pakistani army is playing a duplicitous role as it has been blamed for the last many years? Or is there any change of heart in practice? Has there been anything seen on the ground? Yes, Pakistani Prime Minister has always talked about bringing the Taliban to the negotiating table, which is a great achievement. But we have not seen anything tangible like a ceasefire. Prime Minister Imran Khan had told President Ashraf Ghani he would help, but then he called him, sorry, we cannot help on the ceasefire. So what is your take on that one? How could the US approach? And there is difficult to disengage Pakistan from the Afghan affairs when it comes from the US foreign policy perspective to the region, especially the Afghan conflict.
Well, the reality remains that most of the Taliban leadership has been in Pakistan for years. Pakistan was the only country that maintained diplomatic relations with the Taliban, even though 2 other countries had recognized the Taliban regime in the 1990s. And Pakistan does think that the Taliban would be a better choice for Pakistan than what it considers to be pro-Indian Afghan politicians. That said, I think there is an understanding in Pakistan that the restoration of the status quo ante may not actually be in the benefit of Pakistan. And that is why Pakistan has not encouraged the Taliban to go in and take over Kabul and Kandahar if they could. Not that they can, but that's something that Pakistan does not wish to do. So I think what we will see is a complicated set of maneuvers from Pakistan, trying to keep the Taliban on its side while trying to advance the goals of the Taliban, and at the same time indicating to the rest of the world that while we maintain relations with the Taliban, we do not control the Taliban. And so they will not tell the Taliban to do certain things because that would indicate that the Taliban are totally controlled by Pakistan, which Pakistan denies. In the long term, I think that Pakistan will have to understand that the old vision of a Pakistan-imposed solution on Afghanistan has only resulted in Pakistan having fewer options in Afghanistan than before. There are fewer and fewer Afghan groups that have goodwill for Pakistan, and Pakistan should not want that situation. And secondly, whatever happens in Afghanistan will have consequences in Pakistan. And so therefore, I think that Pakistan will have to continue to weigh that. Will they do it? I mean, you know that I have made these arguments for 20 odd years. They haven't been heard, but they have a logic of their own. As Pakistan's economy falters, as Pakistan's dependence on China increases, which makes some Pakistanis, including top leaders of the military, worry. Do we want to become China's vassal state? And then they say, no, we need to balance it. So how do they balance it? Those are the factors that will have an impact on the outcome. But one thing is clear. The government of Afghanistan and the Afghan National Security Forces are not as weak as they used to be at one point in history, where Islamabad could actually tell Kabul what to do, and Kabul had few choices. I think that Afghanistan in the last 19 years has been able to build something that is Afghan. And there are Afghans who would fight and die for Afghanistan's independence and sovereignty. So that reality is something that has to be borne in mind. I saw a question from somebody about an interim coalition government. The fact of the matter is that this is not 2001. Afghanistan hasn't collapsed. It hasn't had years of civil war, and therefore nothing is functional. There is running water in Afghan cities. There's electricity. There are schools that function. There are businesses that run. There are airports at which flights arrive. There are road networks that are operational. So therefore, in a situation like this, why would the Afghans turn around and say, yeah, let a few diplomats get together in a European capital and create a government for us? I think that will not happen. And just as we are mindful of what the Taliban will not stand for, we should also be mindful of what the Afghan government will not stand for. These ideas of a coalition government are 20 years out of date. What, in fact, I would have recommended if I was consulted while drafting Doha would have been that there will be talks between the Afghan government, other major Afghan political parties, and the Taliban, instead of this term intra-Afghan dialogue that virtually delegitimizes the Afghan government. This is a unique thing. The Americans helped create a government, and then in your negotiations with the Taliban, you virtually delegitimize the government you've created and you formally recognize. That was an absolute absurdity of diplomacy, with all due respect to those who were engaged with it. And it needs to be undone. The negotiations for the future of Afghanistan have to be between the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the insurgent group called the Taliban. That is how negotiations always occur when there is a non-state group trying to delegitimize a state. You don't make them put them at an equal level. And I don't know whether that will happen or can happen because of the complication of what is already there. You can't, the US has signed an agreement. And so to undo that agreement will require a lot of effort. And I don't think I agree with Ambassador Wayne that there is no appetite in Washington, DC to go back to square one. But at the same time, I think the ideas of Ambassador Kabulov and people like that, oh yeah, let there be an interim coalition government. Who will form that interim coalition government? In the end, the Afghans have to figure out how to live with one another. The Americans have just they're still figuring out how to live with one another, the Republicans and the Democrats. So why do we assume that only foreign governments can tell Afghans how to learn to live with one another? They will figure it out. Give them time. Just make sure that one side does not overrun the other with support from outside. And that is what Afghan security requirement is. That's all.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You talked about a number of important things here, how an outside support for a certain group could be a disruptive force also, which I think is important, how these parties could play their independence in talks, which has always been questioned when it comes to regarding Taliban. Ambassador Mosazzai, there was talking about regional dynamics, Pakistan, India, the Russian envoy for Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov, 2 days ago announced another conference to be hosted in Moscow, inviting Pakistan, Taliban, and many other countries in the group. How do you see that? Is it in competition with what the United States is doing in the region, or is the Russia actively undermining US efforts, to the proxies? Are we going back to square one, or how do you see? And plus, what role can India play in Afghanistan? How far it can go, and what would be the expectations of the Afghan government from Indian partners?
Sadly, it does appear like the Russian government, or at least Ambassador Kabulov, in his capacity as Russia's special envoy for Afghanistan, are turning the Afghan peace process into an issue where they can score points against the United States. And I think part of the blame also lies with the US government, because it's in the absence of a clear transparent, high-level U.S. diplomatic engagement on building regional consensus, that you have these efforts that are not inclusive. Earlier, I underlined the necessity of having an inclusive mechanism that involves all of Afghanistan's neighbors and all the key regional powers. The Moscow format will exclude many countries in the region, not just India, but many of Afghanistan's next door neighbors, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and other countries. You need a mechanism that brings all these countries together. And for that reason, we have always advocated for an existing mechanism that is 9 years old now, and that includes all of Afghanistan's neighbors and all the countries in the region, plus regional and international organizations, the United Nations, and Afghanistan's international partners, including the US and the EU. And that mechanism is the Heart of Asia Istanbul process. And some make the argument that that's probably too inclusive. It will not allow for discussions in small groups that need to happen among countries that probably have a bigger stake in or an influence with regards to the Afghan peace process. But that can easily be addressed under the umbrella of the Heart of Asia Istanbul process. You could have subgroups discussing specific issues. You could have subgroups of specific countries, either in the format of trilaterals or quadrilaterals or other formats. But you have to have an all-inclusive platform that brings together everyone. You cannot exclude this country or that country from this or that format, because that will continue the negative dynamic of regional inertia and regional divisions when it comes to the situation in Afghanistan. A good example is the trilateral mechanism that the United States had with China and Russia, where they invited Pakistan, but they always excluded India. And it's just not just India that's excluded. It's also, as I mentioned, Afghanistan's other key neighbors to the north in Central Asia. They have to be engaged on the peace process in Afghanistan, because this is not just about a peace deal between the Taliban and the Afghan government. This has to be about Afghanistan's role and place in the region for years to come. Failure, as I noted earlier, will destabilize the region, but success will help the region realize the vision of regional connectivity, regional economic integration, and it will be a win-win proposition for not just Afghanistan, but also for the entire region. I do believe that India, as a major regional power, as a major player on the world stage, has a key role to play, but India and Pakistan cannot bring their internal problems or their bilateral problems, whether it's on Kashmir or other issues, to the situation in Afghanistan. The same is true for Iran with regards to the relationship that it has with GCC countries. These countries must put aside those differences and focus on the common goal of a peaceful Afghanistan that they can support and where they can play an important role. And I totally agree with the point that Ambassador Haqqani made, that it's not up to neighbors of Afghanistan or up to countries in the West to make suggestions, let alone decisions, on the form of government in Afghanistan and on the system of government in Afghanistan. That's a decision that Afghans and Afghans only have to make, and Afghans are more than capable of doing that. I think the reason why the Taliban are still bent on a strategy of taking over government in Afghanistan by force is because there is uncertainty, there is lack of clarity among the different key regional players. If you have that consensus paired with the international consensus that does exist for a responsible US withdrawal and support to a peaceful Afghanistan, then the Taliban will have no choice but to sit down with the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and negotiate a real peace deal that can endure.
Thank you very much. You talked about international partnership, international consensus on this one. When President Trump, through Ambassador Khalilzad, struck a deal with Taliban a lot of allies were not consulted. The main ally, the Afghan government, was not even talked about. NATO is, on the other hand, was left alone in a sort of vagueness and darkness. Ambassador Wayne, NATO Secretary General, announced that if we came together to Afghanistan, we leave together in Afghanistan, and our withdrawal will be condition-based. US is now reviewing this whole deal. How do you see that statement? Is that a lobby, a pressure? Can US put its own stake at danger with allies in NATO just going unilaterally, withdrawing from Afghanistan and putting everybody else in danger? Well, majority of the support, air support, comes from US forces for the NATO countries in Afghanistan. How was that form the broader coalition that the United States has in NATO? How does that impact?
Well, I see that statement as a statement of support for the review that's going on in the US administration. And if you look, there have been statements in the United States also from a number of different corners that are all pushing in that same direction. From the conservative newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, for example, a very strong message about the importance of having a good outcome, not just going out of Afghanistan. And others are speaking up now too that were quiet during or quieter during the Trump years, let's say, because people were not comfortable with that approach as it evolved. And it was quite clear to many, many people that President Trump just wanted to get those troops out because he'd promised that in the campaign, as Ambassador Haqqani said, and he wasn't really looking at the effects of that. And I believe what will come out is that he was overruling most of his advisors, his military and diplomatic advisors, in that process. And he was the president, so he could do that, but he's not the president now. So now we can have an honest debate about the right kind of outcome. And I think that needs to include our partners and allies who have been so important in working with us in Afghanistan during these years, even though for many years we as the United States have had the major presence and the major aid spending. That assistance and that presence from allies and partners was very important in sustaining that. So I think this statement from the NATO Secretary General is really a statement of support for the serious review that's going on in Washington. And it fits exactly with what the new administration has said about the importance of alliances, the importance of partnerships, that they're going to, as we sometimes say in our colloquial English, double down on partnerships and alliances. We were going to recognize the importance of that and work with it. Now, one of the interesting things about that, and this is the same thing about a regional diplomacy, it's a lot more work, right? Mm-hmm. It's a lot more work to sustain coalitions and to build understanding in the region. It's not going to be easy to do what Ambassador Mozasai has said, to try to get consensus among the key parties. But it doesn't mean it's not worth doing, because after you've made those kind of investments, it's going to be a more lasting process. And in a situation, you don't need that in every situation of civil strife around the world, but in this one, you do. And that's the reason I mentioned in part the former Yugoslavia, many differences between the former Yugoslavia and Afghanistan. But the one thing that is similar is that many countries in the region and beyond were affected by what was going on there. And that's true in Afghanistan also. And it's even more complicated in Afghanistan, and getting that regional consensus is not going to be easy. But if you can get it, you have a much better chance that an agreement will be lasting for the benefit of all the countries in the region, as well as Afghanistan. And that's why it is so worthwhile to make that investment. And that's why it is very short-sighted to pull back, especially when you have started some positive things. It is positive that the Taliban are talking to the non-Taliban Afghans, even if they're still, as we would say, miles apart on their agenda. It's better that they're talking than not. Now, can we turn that into an even a better and more productive dialogue and outcome? And yes, I think we can. Can partners, I'm going to repeat, partners in the region can make a difference? Yes. Can we also have an international facilitator to help move this along? Yes. Should we remove all the levers that the United States and others have to help sustain this process? No, we should not.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Haqqani, the whole discussion talks about regional efforts and how can the countries in the region come together rather than unilaterally one country or another go and proxy or do something that is against the interests of the opposing country. In your experience, you've traveled to the region, you've written books, wonderful. I enjoyed reading your books actually very much. What role can Pakistan play in, there was this geostrategic depth theory in Pakistan prevailing for many years. And we hear that there's a new theory of geoeconomic strategic interests in the region. How can that be brought more into practice? We have not seen anything. Are there still bets hedged against a number of things by the Pakistani army, especially? Or are we going to see another repetition of the Nawaz military conflict for different interests in the region, be that India or Afghanistan?
We must remember that reality has its own dynamic. And I think that all theories collapse under the pressure of reality. So it was not the theory of communism that failed in the Soviet Union, it was the practice and the reality that collapsed. What we are seeing is a slow but definite realization coming in Pakistan that its strategic and grand great power ambitions are being foiled by its very weak economy. Recently, it borrowed money from China to be able to pay Saudi Arabia. It can't do that forever. Eventually, it has to figure out how to generate revenue, how to increase its productivity. In terms of wanting to have good relations with both China and the United States, the reality is that India, for example, which Pakistan considers to be its rival, has a much larger trade relationship with China than China has with Pakistan. Pakistan's exports to Pakistan's bilateral trade with the United States is only $6.5 billion. India's is $143 billion. So at some point, instead of making it into a zero-sum game, people in Pakistan, including the top military leadership, will acknowledge that the logic of economics should be pursued in the economic realm. Doesn't mean Pakistan stops thinking about its own position on Kashmir, etc. But instead of making it a zero-sum game, it has to open up. If that can be accomplished, there is potential for almost $68 billion of trade between Central Asia and India through Pakistan and Afghanistan. And that will benefit everybody in the way. There is potential for gas pipelines running from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan into Pakistan and then into India. The fact remains that Pakistan, having a smaller economy, is not necessarily lucrative for investors in its own right. But if you add the larger economy of India and a smaller economy of Afghanistan to the equation, then it becomes a much more sustainable model for investors. So just as the Southeast Asian countries have boomed through ASEAN, and Europe has had tremendous advantage from creating the European Union, it's time for a better understanding among the South Asian countries. South Asia was the most integrated region in the world before 1947. Trains ran all the way from Peshawar to Calcutta and on to Myanmar. That needs to, but now you can't get a flight to Nepal from Karachi without going to Dubai, which is in the other direction. So all of that integration has given way to becoming the least integrated region in the world. Minimal trade between the countries of the region, about 5 to 8%. Compare that with the North American Free Trade Agreement, Europe, ASEAN, Latin America. So that has to change. And eventually, I am quite confident that the reality of circumstances will force the Pakistani leadership, whether they like it or not, whatever their theories, they will have to recognize this reality. When will we have that glasnost? When will we have that perestroika in Pakistan? One cannot predict a date, but I can see that with less Western assistance coming to Pakistan, the Chinese loans becoming due, and the Chinese being as rapacious as they are in demanding things from countries where they invest that are not easy to grant. And the fact that the Chinese do not create any employment in Pakistan through their investment, the investments they make, they bring their own convict labor from China to work on their projects. So no jobs are created. Pakistan is indebted to China, and an infrastructure is built that links Pakistan only to China. That is not a sustainable model. Now, will that happen in time for that to have a positive influence of the Afghan peace process? Maybe not. Maybe not in the short term. But things are moving in that direction. And eventually, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh have to become one trading bloc. And once they do, it will be beneficial for all of them.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You talked about the very long-term effects and possibility. When that's going to happen, we don't know. But in the meantime, it's Afghans that are being killed and dying. Ambassador Mosazzai, what are the expectations there? Like, we are expecting in Afghanistan a short-term solution so that we have a ceasefire, we have Taliban back in the negotiations, because they're not. They're traveling around the countries, they're in Moscow, they're everywhere else, and the Afghan delegation is waiting for them. The Afghans are looking for something quick impact. Economic impacts are there for long term. What do you think? How can that play out for the benefits of the people that are suffering from not having a ceasefire?
I just wanted to follow up on what Ambassador Haqqani was saying. I think Pakistan will change. The Pakistani army, Pakistani military establishment will recognize sooner or later that it has to become subservient to the will of the people through their democratically elected representatives, through the parliament. But that may require more time than we have for the Afghan peace process. So the timelines don't align. And this is why it is absolutely, and obviously US pressure has not worked. We have been witness over the past 19 years to various levels of US pressure and US engagement with Pakistan on Afghanistan. It has not resulted in any change in the strategic calculus of the Pakistani military. What can influence decision-making in Islamabad and Rawalpindi is pressure and influence from the region, from China, from Russia, and from other neighbors of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that can only happen if you have a clear commitment, a clear strategy by the United States that it has decided to leave Afghanistan militarily. It has political interests, it has other security interests, it has economic interests, and can continue to stay engaged, continue to stay present in Afghanistan, in the region, but it has to make it clear to the major regional powers that it will stay committed to its decision, to its intent to leave Afghanistan militarily. And once that clarity and that is there, provided to the countries in the region, I think it will become a lot easier for the region to coalesce around a unified position on support to Afghan peace, and also even a guarantee mechanism for a peace agreement in Afghanistan. And that can quickly, I think, translate into the kind of dynamic in the region's relationship with Pakistan that could be only beneficial for the peace process, and again, forcing the Taliban to the negotiating table to work out a peace agreement with the Afghan government. And it will also, I think, facilitate an extension in the withdrawal timeline for the US military disengagement from Afghanistan. And obviously, I think that can respond to the question that you posed with regards to the ceasefire in Afghanistan, which absolutely is an urgent requirement, an urgent demand of the Afghan people, because otherwise, the only scenario we will be facing will be an escalating conflict, escalating levels of violence, and that will not result in the Taliban taking over Kandahar or Kabul or Mazar or any other province. It will just mean that there will be more intense fighting between the government and the Taliban. And the Afghan government, the Afghan army, the police, they are capable of holding territory. And even right now, more than 95% of operations, security military operations, are planned, executed independently by Afghan national security and defense forces. So they will continue to be able to do that. But in the absence of a real, serious, substantive negotiations process, we will just be moving, I think, rapidly towards a scenario where violence levels that are already unacceptable further increasing.
Thank you. You talked about interesting point, that possibility of the violence rising up to unprecedented levels. Ambassador Wayne, Taliban leader in Doha, Mullah Baradar, a couple of days ago issued an open letter to President Biden and the American public, urging U.S. government to withdraw from Afghanistan by the deadline agreed in Doha agreement. On the other hand, they claim that they would they have kept their promise and whatever they agreed upon. But in reality, they have not reduced violence. They have not gone into meaningful and goodwill on the discussion with the Afghan delegation. They have not cut ties with that. What options does the Biden administration have before the deadline approaches? Can they trust Taliban with all those claims? And they even said that we're gonna be giving women their rights, which is new, because in the past, nothing has come like that from the statements from Taliban leadership at all. What are the options? How Taliban can be trusted, and what is there for the U.S. to deal with this few months remaining by the deal?
Well, I think no, the Taliban statements cannot be trusted. There needs to be independent verification that, in fact, they are meeting commitments and that there's substance behind what they're claiming. And so far, the consistent series of reports and indications are that, in fact, they aren't doing as they say. And this shows up in many different ways. There have been a whole series of reports from Taliban-controlled areas in Afghanistan recently talking about the status of women in those areas, or the status of any kind of what we might call dissent or differing approaches or opinions, and it just doesn't exist. Secondly, there are a whole string of indications that the Taliban are not following their commitments dealing with Al-Qaeda and others. They are still dealing with Al-Qaeda and others. So I think there needs to be there is healthy skepticism required, especially because a full pullout of U.S. troops is a major move that would indeed give additional leverage to the Taliban. And that's why those commitments were put there. There is debate about, well, what were the commitments about the level of violence? And I think that was a bit ambiguous, but it doesn't mean that it's not an important element that the Biden administration should take into consideration before it makes very important moves. It's becoming clear in a number of reports that, as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of opposition among US officials and military officials to President Trump's withdrawal down to the current level of troops, that people did not think that was wise for a range of reasons. And so I think it's completely legitimate to look at those again. And on the other hand, it's not surprising the Taliban would try to object, because they saw a path to success in front of them. But that's not the success that's in the interest of the United States, from my perspective, and not, I would say, from the interests of the broad Afghan people, or from neighbors like including Pakistan, including others, even including Iran, who we have not, as the United States, been able to talk to. What is in the interest is a sustainable stability in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And then we in the United States, I think, do have an interest also in the fact that there are these millions of newly emerging Afghans who have a different view of the world and a different view of their prospects in the future than the Taliban have. And I think we do have, there is a moral commitment to them. There is a moral commitment to the women of Afghanistan that we have made. And I think from a United States policy debate perspective, that needs to be taken into account. And I think the Biden administration is going to do that. You know, one of the things the Biden administration has been very clear on is that they do value democracy and they value human rights. Now they have to weigh that. Of course, you can't do everything in every part of the world, and you can't sustain involvement in all places. But that has to be a very important part of the review process that's going on right now. And we'll see where they came out. We haven't yet mentioned that there was this major report that came out of a commission set up by the US Congress to look at Afghanistan and make recommendations. And that commission, which was sort of housed or seated around the US Institute of Peace, came out with a very powerful report that says, do not cut and run here. We as the United States need to stay committed to a process to bring Afghanistan to peace. And if that means looking at conditions rather than timelines, we should look at those conditions and focus on that. And I think that was a very wise report, and it had bipartisan participation and bipartisan support in the United States.
Absolutely, you talked about bipartisan support. There are voices coming out of the House, and many ex-diplomats. Madeleine Albright just wrote an op-ed in CNN last night and talked about how the consequences of anything in Afghanistan would have global consequences and results everywhere. Mitch McConnell, leader of the Senate, in his statement previously said the United States should withdraw responsibly. I'm going to come, we are close to the end. I'm going to ask a question from Master Haqqani and come back to all of you. US is reviewing the whole policy. There are a number of things that were forgotten, purposely or not, in the deal. Say the sanctuaries Taliban enjoy Pakistan, whatever support they have, or the region. What would be some specific points you would provide to the team or the Biden administration or President Biden when they're reviewing the deal to consider to have a long-lasting impact and peace in Afghanistan, addressing the regional dynamics concerning Pakistan, India, Central Asian states? All of these countries have their own interests in that region. What would be your advice if you're a consultant on that issue?
I've said many times that Pakistan's concerns about Afghanistan rest on the assumption that India may use Afghanistan against Pakistan. Now, historically, that hasn't happened. It is more an imaginary fear. In the 1965 war, 1971 war, when Afghanistan was more outspoken on the subject of Pashtunistan, even then Afghanistan did not try to create a pincer for Pakistan by creating trouble on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. But because Pakistan and Afghanistan have an overlapping population, it's the same ethnicity, same history. Until 1893, a large part of what is Pakistan was actually part of Afghanistan. All of that creates a psychological fear that there is potential for India taking advantage of its relationship with Afghanistan to try and create a two-front situation for Pakistan, because Pakistan's military lives in the dread and fear of India. And the assumption is that India is an eternal enemy of Pakistan, etc., things that I do not believe, but they do. A solution to that would be an agreement, a tripartite agreement between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, assuring Pakistan that Afghanistan will not be used against for any kind of military or intelligence operations against Pakistan. It has been proposed, it has been discussed, and it's time to actually formalize it, because I don't think the Afghans are interested in creating problems for Pakistan. All they want is for Pakistan not to create problems for Afghanistan. As far as the Taliban are concerned, the very fact that most of the Taliban leadership, until they were offered better housing and better facilities in Doha, have lived in Pakistan. Most of them have their families in Pakistan. That is a leverage Pakistan has chosen not to exercise. But if it wanted to, it could. It could put a lot more pressure on the Taliban than it does by saying that you will not have the facilities that you have had for so many years in our country unless and until you become more flexible. Pakistan's response to that criticism is that if we did that, the Taliban, who are armed to the teeth, could become a security problem for Pakistan. But they will become a security problem for Pakistan anyway, even if they are able to create or to shift their safe havens to the other side. They now know Pakistani society, are very integrated into it, have many relationships with Pakistani radical Islamist groups, and Pakistan has to make a decision on that subject sometime soon. I'm not anticipating it because unfortunately Pakistan's leadership has missed many an opportunity to try and address this problem. But if they see that that they came to the brink of a deal, which was quite favorable to them in the sense that it would have enabled the Taliban to come to power in Afghanistan without creating problems for Pakistan, and the Americans liked Pakistan's role in bringing the Taliban to the table. All of that they came to the brink and didn't get it, that might make Pakistan rethink this entire equation. In the end, the Taliban are a small component of Afghan society. They deserve a political role proportionate to their numbers and their influence. But if Pakistan does not act soon, Pakistan will face an outcome similar to the one in Cambodia for the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge remained an insurgent group for far too long after losing power, and all negotiating processes, neighbors in getting involved, meetings all over Southeast Asia and East Asia, they all took place just like they're taking place in Afghanistan. But an insurgent group has its time, and then the time runs out. And eventually when Thailand and other neighbors stopped helping the Khmer Rouge or tolerating them, most of them ended up dying and collapsing. An insurgency cannot be assumed to be able to run on forever. Everybody talks about how the US is tired of being in Afghanistan. Well, let us be honest. It can't be easy to be Pakistan or the Taliban either. So here is the paradox. I have always said that the moment the United States says we are not going to pursue an end game based on a timeline, but it will be based on conditions, that is the time when Pakistan and Taliban will reconsider their strategies. So far, all that has happened is every year somebody in America says we are getting out next year or in 2 years. So they say, okay, 1 more year of waiting, 2 more years of waiting. So getting out will be quicker and easier when you say we are not getting out.
Absolutely, I understand the glimmer of hope that has been given Taliban and other supporters of Taliban by US administration in the last many years, starting from 2014 when President Obama announced a timeline of withdrawal. And they say, you have time, you have watches and we have time. That's expression.
It's an argument I have made many times. I have written it so many times that now sometimes when people ask me to write it again, I say, hey, I've written it so many times, it's just a rerun of the argument. The US will be able to get out of Afghanistan sooner the moment it stops saying it's eager to get out.
Absolutely. Quite a wise recommendation to President Biden. I hope they listen to this one and not repeat the mistake of a past administrations that we have been having for the last 20 years. Ambassador Musa Zaid, then I will come to Ambassador for his final remarks. What is your take? If you were consulted by the Biden administration, what would be your specific advice and points when they are reviewing this whole deal with Taliban?
I think it's what I just mentioned, to basically support an inclusive regional diplomatic framework for building regional consensus and a guarantee mechanism for Afghan peace, because without that, we will just be repeating the mistakes of the past 30 years and the dynamics of the past 30 years, where you have different countries supporting different groups, if you like. And I think that's the only way for the US to be able to get an extension for its military withdrawal from Afghanistan that will not result in the Taliban resuming large-scale operations against US bases in Afghanistan, against US personnel in Afghanistan. Because if you have the region on the same page as the United States, then they will play their role in working with Pakistan and working with Iran and working with other countries that have influence with the Taliban to make sure that there is enough time for an Afghan peace negotiation to take its due course, for an agreement to be reached, and then for the American military to depart fully from Afghanistan. Without that, I think we risk an intensification of the conflict in Afghanistan. We have not had any respite over the winter season, which is usually typical. We've had a spiraling cycle of violence, not just military on military, but violence that is actually affecting mainly ordinary people in Afghanistan, civilians, civil society activists, women activists, government employees, professors. I mean, there was just this incident today where 2 Kabul University professors were assassinated in front of the university. And then I'll just, if I may, address this question from Eric Frost here from San Diego State University. It's on a slightly different topic. His question is, are alliances between universities in the US and in Afghanistan of value in this situation? I believe totally, not just between universities and think tanks and research centers in the US and Afghanistan, but also between think tanks and research institutions and universities in Afghanistan and in the countries in the region. That's what we are trying to do through the Heart of Asia Society, our think tank. We already have dialogues with Pakistan, with an influential think tank in Pakistan. We're trying to do the same with our Central Asian neighbors, with Iran, with Russia, China, other countries. Because oftentimes, given the history of mistrust and division in the region between different countries, it's not easy for them to sit down around the same table and address the main issue or the root causes of an issue. But it's a lot easier to do that at settings that are more informal. So track 2 and track 1.5, diplomatic engagements, and that's what we have been trying to do. Obviously, that requires more time, and that's what we have been advocating, that you need to have an inclusive framework, you need to give it time and allow the Afghan parties, the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the Taliban enough time to work out the real differences that exist between them.
Thank you. Touching on that University Alliance project and efforts, how they value the partnerships. Just adding to this information before I come to Ambassador Wayne on the question that I posed to Ambassador Haqqani. Our university has been working with various universities, not only in Afghanistan, but also Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, in Uzbekistan, and in Pakistan. We right now have a wonderful project supported by the State Department, led by one of my wonderful colleagues, Dr. Patrick McNamara here. We call it Partnership 2020. We are aligning universities across the United States and India. So those people-to-people, academic relationship do value in enlightening thoughts and ideas. So absolutely, I second your thought on that one. Ambassador Wayne, final question to you before we end up. We have a few minutes to spare here. What would be your specific recommendation to President Biden on how to deal with Taliban and the peace in Afghanistan?
Well, first, let me say I agree fully on the importance of ties between universities and also between civil society organizations. And now more than ever, civil society organizations in Europe and the United States need to reaffirm those ties in Afghanistan and in the neighboring countries, and to help build that understanding. I mean, there's a concerted campaign going on right now by the Taliban to kill civil society leaders. And there needs to be signs of support from outside of Afghanistan for these individuals who are really trying to take their country to a better place. So my advice to President Biden would be that the US presence in Afghanistan needs to be tied to conditions, specific conditions, and that we should sustain a military and intelligence presence there right now, because we are not seeing satisfactory movement toward peace, toward a serious peace negotiation. That we, of course, should be clear that we want to eliminate all of that as soon as it is possible, as Afghans are actually moving to an agreed situation that has a very good chance of sustaining that peace. But that's going to take a lot of serious negotiation. It's also going to take commitments from people in the region, from other international parties, to provide checks and balances and safeguards as this moves forward. It's not all of a sudden that if you even get to the point of signing a piece of paper, everybody's going to trust each other right away. They're not going to do that. And there's going to be a lot of hard work. What do you do in a peace situation with all the former fighters and the former security personnel? You need to integrate them. You need to find jobs for them. And this isn't just going to spring up automatically in Afghanistan. It's going to take the support of outside supporters, donors, international institutions, regional parties to help create that situation, and to have the checks on the spoilers, because there will always be spoilers in situations like this, those people who don't want to agree to a peace agreement. So there's a lot still to do, even if you get a serious negotiation doing. But I would tell President Biden that you really need to double down on getting a serious negotiation. That means keeping your levers in Afghanistan. It means working with neighbors and other international partners. And it means finding ways to reinforce the peace process, as I mentioned, including looking at third-party facilitators as this goes forward. And yes, it's quite possible the Taliban will pull back if they don't like what's going on for a while. But still, they are under a lot of pressure also. They're tired of fighting. They're going to, if they lose regional support and international support, one of the reasons they're traveling around right now is because they're trying to make sure that they aren't losing that support. But if we really make clear that they're not keeping their commitments, that they're really trying to just achieve victory under the facade of having a peace negotiation, I think they're going to start getting a more consistent message, as my colleagues have said, from others, that, you know, come on, this is a time to try and find a way forward. And then we have to be patient. Strategic patience, I think, is in favor of peace, is really important by all parties who favor that. And that at some point is going to be meaning coming down hard on the Afghans in Kabul if they're fighting among themselves and they're not coming up with realistic ideas, which we've seen them do quite often, or if they're just stealing this, money if they can away from international assistance. That can't be allowed either. So it's a lot of work. It's a hard road, but is the much better road to go forward.
Thank you very much. Wonderful advice, great advice to Biden administration. I hope they listen. We have a number of people from the administration, I believe, in the listening in. So that would be a great opportunity for them to listen to a different thought, mindset. I would hand over the session to Mr. Hanif Sufizadeh, my colleague. Any comments? I just want to extend my appreciation and thank you to all. Hanif, take it on. You're mute, Hanif.
What an interesting talk from all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you, honorable panelists, for your insights, and all others for your participation. The Center for Afghanistan Studies' goal is to offer more such sessions on hot topics of Afghanistan in the region. Please stay tuned for our announcement at our Facebook page. And if you would like to, you can share your email address with us to receive our periodic newsletter. Please be safe, be healthy, and all the best. Thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you very much, ambassadors. Thanks a lot. You guys have a wonderful day and night. Thank you very much. And if you can close it out.
Thank you.